What if humanity's last hope wasn't a city, a bunker, or a spaceship, but a train? A single train, endlessly circling a frozen, lifeless Earth, never allowed to slow down, never permitted to stop. Not for a storm, not for a breakdown, not even for grief. Because the second it stops, every last human soul on board ceases to exist. This is not a distant fantasy. This is the reality these people wake up to every day, rattling through a dead world at full speed, carrying the final embers of human civilization. It began with desperation, as most catastrophes do. The planet was burning. Scientists watched helplessly as temperatures climbed year after year in a last, frantic act of survival. They released an experimental chemical called CW7, designed to cool the Earth, to buy humanity a little more time. But nature does not negotiate with desperate men. The cooling did not stop. It spiraled. Every ocean, river, field, every living thing was buried beneath a merciless layer of ice. The cure had become the extinction, but one man had seen it coming. Wilford. Visionary founder of Wilford Industries, he built a train unlike anything the world had ever seen. Its tracks stretched across every continent, nearly 438,000 kilometers of iron rail, wrapping round the frozen globe like a steel spine. The engine was a marvel of engineering, self-sustaining, drawing energy from its own motion, never needing fuel, never needing rest. Every year it completed one full revolution. For 17 years, it had not missed a single lap. But the train was never built for everyone. Up front, life was almost beautiful. Restaurants with real food, warm and fragrant. Schools where children laughed. Greenhouses where plants grew under artificial light. Nightclubs where people danced. While the frozen wasteland blurred past the windows, those passengers had paid for their seats. They had earned their warmth. But at the very tail of the train, a different world entirely, separated by dozens of locked doors and an ocean of injustice. These were the ones who had forced their way aboard in those final terrifying hours. Clinging to any hope of survival, they had no money, no tickets, no rights. What they had was a protein bar each day, a small, tasteless block of nutrition, and the company of hundreds of others who were just as hungry, broken, and furious. For 17 years, the tail section had tried to rise up. Small rebellions, desperate uprisings, frantic attempts to push through those locked doors. Toward warmth, toward food, toward dignity. And for 17 years, every attempt drowned in blood. The guards were always ready. The system was always stronger. The people always lost. Until now. In the depths of that tail section, a young man named Curtis. He had stopped grieving and started planning. Quiet, intense, carrying a deep weight. Curtis had spent months preparing for something bigger than any rebellion before. And by his side, always, was the older man who had shaped him, Gilliam. A scarred, wise, deeply respected elder, who carried his own secrets like wounds. The plan was precise and it was dangerous. Every morning, guards moved through. In those brief moments, 3 carriage doors would swing open in sequence. That was the window. Narrow, violent, and absolutely necessary. Curtis had studied the guards for months and came to a single conclusion that either made him brave or suicidal. Their guns were empty. Every bullet had been spent suppressing past rebellions. Now those weapons were nothing more than props, tools of fear rather than force. He shared this belief only with those he trusted completely. Among them was Edgar. A young man who looked at Curtis the way a younger brother looks at someone he would follow off the edge of the world. The moment was coming. They could feel it in their bones. Then, without warning, something happened that turned Curtis's slow burn into a wildfire. A woman in a yellow coat arrived from the front carriages, polished, professional, and chillingly calm. Under the pretense of a routine medical inspection, she selected 2 children from the tail section and removed them. When a father, trembling with rage and helplessness, hurled his shoe at her and opened a gash on her head, she simply smiled, pressed a cloth to the wound, and walked away with his children. Shortly after, a senior train official named Mason arrived to deliver the consequences. She had a man's arm thrust out of the train's exterior panel, held against the frozen air until his flesh turned white and hard as marble. Then, with a single hammer blow, that arm shattered like frozen glass. As the man's scream tore through the carriage, Mason addressed them all with cold composure, reminding them that Wilford had given them life, and that this was the price of forgetting it. Something inside Curtis went completely still. Then it caught fire. The next morning, the moment arrived. As guards stepped into the carriage with their protein bars, Curtis walked straight toward the nearest one, pressed the barrel of the man's own gun against his own temple, and pulled the trigger. Silence. The gun was empty. Exactly as he had predicted, that single moment of silence shattered every wall of fear in the carriage. His companion surged forward like a wave that had been held back for 17 years. Guards fell. Doors were forced open with a long metal pipe, jammed so they couldn't close again. They fought through car after car, bruised and bleeding, until they finally reached the prison section. Rows of metal lockers bolted to the walls. Inside one of them, shivering and disoriented, was the man they had come for. Nam Gong, the engineer who had designed the train's entire security system, and the only person on board who could open every locked door between the tail and the engine. Nam Gong was a broken man, hollowed out by years of confinement and kept compliant through addiction to a special compound produced on the train. His hand shook, his eyes darted, but the sharpness behind them was still there, buried under layers of dependency. Curtis made him an offer, 1 pill for each door he opened. It was a cold transaction, but it was honest. Then Nam Gong quietly unlocked the locker beside his own, and out stepped a young woman, his daughter, Yuna. She was strange and beautiful and seemed to perceive things slightly before they happened. As if reality reached her half-second earlier than everyone else, Nam Gong revised the deal. 2 pills per door. Curtis agreed without hesitation. They moved forward, door by door, section by section. They pressed deeper into the train. What Curtis found in the food production carriage stopped him. Colton. Inside industrial containers, insects were being mechanically ground down, processed, compressed, shaped into the protein bars that had been the tail section's only sustenance for 17 years. He stood there for a long moment, staring at what their survival had actually cost them. He said nothing to the others. Some truths he had learned were better swallowed alone. But in that same carriage, he noticed something else. The chef was placing small capsules into the bars. The same type of capsules that had been delivering secret rebellion instructions to the tail section. And for months, Curtis demanded answers. The chef was equally confused. He simply placed what was left for him. Someone else entirely was feeding them their own revolution. The latest message, unfolded in Curtis's hands, read a single word: water. Gilliam interpreted it immediately. Somewhere ahead was the train's water filtration system, the lifeblood of every passenger on board. If they could seize it, they wouldn't need to fight all the way to the engine. They could simply turn off the tap and bring the front carriages to their knees. Without another drop of blood being spilled, the group moved forward, energized and unified. But when Gong reached for the door of the water section, Yona suddenly gasped and reached out to stop him. She was too late. The door swung open, and on the other side stood a wall of armed guards, weapons raised, eyes cold, as if they had been waiting there all along. What followed was not a skirmish. It was a massacre in slow motion. Then it was interrupted by something no one expected, an announcement ordering everyone to brace for the annual bridge crossing. Guards began a countdown. The train hit the frozen overpass with bone-rattling force, shattering decades of accumulated ice. Everyone dropped to the floor as the carriage shook and groaned. The frozen world outside exploded against the windows. When the bridge was behind them, they fought again. But this time Mason appeared, making a promise that felt like a death sentence. 74% of them would not survive. Then the train entered the tunnel, and everything went dark. Not dim, but completely, absolutely dark. Through their night vision goggles, Mason's guards began to move. People were cut down in the blackness, screaming at shadows. Curtis roared into the darkness, calling for torches from the rear of the train. A man, whose arm had been shattered by Mason's cruelty, came running with fire in his remaining hand. Light flooded back into the carriage and turned the tide. Mason tried to crawl to an emergency panel to seal the doors, but Curtis's knife found her leg. First, she collapsed, when a guard pressed a blade to Edgar's throat and called out to Curtis to stop. Curtis kept walking. He told himself it was strategy. He told himself the mission mattered more. But deep inside, he knew the truth was heavier, with Mason as their hostage. Curtis pressed forward with a small group toward the engine cabin, where Wilford lived. It was in those final meters, standing before the engine door, that Curtis broke open in a way he had not allowed himself to for a very long time. He told Gong what he had never told anyone. In those first catastrophic days, the tail section had descended into something unthinkable. Starvation had turned human beings into something they could not recognize. Curtis had eaten flesh to survive. He had raised a knife against a woman to take her child. The only reason the child lived, the only reason Edgar was still alive, was because an old man had stepped forward, placed his own hand on the floor, and cut it off at the wrist. He had offered his arm to the starving crowd and begged them to leave the child alone. That man was Gilliam. Curtis wept as he said the words. He had spent 17 years following a man who had saved him from becoming a monster. And now Gilliam was dead, and Curtis was still carrying the knife. What waited for him inside Wilford's cabin was not the tyrant he had imagined. It was a calm, grey-haired man standing over a stove, cooking a meal, smiling like a grandfather. And what Wilford told him dismantled everything Curtis had believed about his own rebellion. The secret messages, coordinates for uprising, and timed revolts that defined life in the tail section for years, all of it had been engineered by Wilford himself, in partnership with Gilliam. Population control through orchestrated violence. Every rebellion was a culling, every uprising was a harvest. Gilliam had been not a resistance leader, but a collaborator. He shaped Curtis into a warrior, and now Wilford, aged and tired, was offering Curtis the seat at the front of the train. He had been watching him. He was impressed. The engine needed a new conductor. Curtis stood at the threshold of everything he had ever wanted: power, justice, control, and might have stepped through it. But then Yona pried up a floor tile. Beneath the gleaming machinery of the sacred engine, curled into a space no adult could fit, was a small child, one of the children taken from the tail section. Working, maintaining. a living cog in a system that literally consumed the young to keep itself moving. And in that moment, all the arguments about necessary order and population balance and the sacred momentum of the train dissolved into something simple and absolute. Curtis beat Wilford to death with his own hands. He gave the matchstick to Yona. He reached into the machinery to free the child, and the machine took his arm in return. Yona ignited Nam Gong's bomb and pulled the child into Wilford's sealed chamber. Curtis and Nam Gong, broken and bleeding, threw themselves in front of the blast to shield the ones they loved. The explosion tore through the engine car and punched a hole in the mountain of ice surrounding the track. The avalanche that followed was absolute, a wall of white erasing the train from front to back, swallowing 17 years of cruelty and sacrifice and survival and sin beneath thousands of tons of ice and silence. When it was over, the world was quiet in a way it had not been in a very long time. Yona and the child climbed out of the wreckage, dressed in the warmest clothes they could find, and stepped onto the surface of the earth for the first time in their lives. The air was cold, but it was breathable. The sky was pale and vast and real. And then, on a distant slope of white and grey, something moved, large, dark, and unmistakably alive. A polar bear, walking through a world that was slowly, impossibly, beginning to thaw. Nam Gong had been right. The ice was retreating. Life was returning. And to small figures, a young woman and a child who had never known anything out the inside of a moving train, stood at the edge of a world being reborn and took the first step into it.